Hi, I'm Graham Blackburn and this is Traditional Woodworking by Hand. And in today's episode, we're continuing what we did with the last episode. We're going through all the tools in one of the many books that I've written. This one is Woodworking Hand Tools. Last time we did measuring. This time we're going to do clamping. Last time we talked about measuring, different systems, different methods, even how to measure things without actually measuring, and a few tricks besides. And we now come to what I think is the second most important part of basic woodworking. As many of you probably know, and I've done episodes on this before, there are four fundamental rules in woodworking. The first one is all about protecting yourself. It's basically you always cut away from yourself. You never position a chisel where it can slip and cut your hand. The second, which is what we're talking about today, is that the workpiece should always be secure. Now, in the past, and we may do more of this in the future, the bench, which is where most American and British woodworkers do their work, the bench is not only a supportive device, it's also replete with all kinds of things like vices of different sorts and bench dogs and holdfasts. It's also replete with a lot of things designed to hold the workpiece secure. But sometimes we need to hold two pieces of the workpiece together in ways that you can't do it on the bench. And that's why we need cramps. Now, I want to mention something right at the start here. In America, we tend to say cramp. And that's because it was the Dutch who first came here and their word for cramp was cramp. So we used cramp. But in Britain, where most of our American woodworking comes from, we use the term clamp, and that's because that comes from the French word. The French were the first to do that. But whether you say cramp or clamp, what you're basically doing is talking about methods and tools designed to hold workpieces together. Now, I want to point out something else right at the beginning, that a cramp, and I may go backwards and forwards between clamp and cramp, but a cramp is designed to hold the workpiece together. That doesn't mean to say that it's designed to hold the workpiece as tight as possible together. If you're joining two pieces of wood together, for example, if they've been properly prepared and properly planed, cramping them with excessive force, that doesn't make the glue any more adhesive. In fact, it may even squeeze the glue out to where the joint doesn't have any adhesive power. So it's not about applying a lot of force. It's simply about making sure that the workpiece or the workpieces are all held together securely so that you can work on them or glue them or do other things to them. So we have a whole bunch of devices that we've developed over the years designed to hold pieces of wood together. Let's look at a few of them. Here is probably one of the earliest devices. This is called a hand screw, a wood screw. And you can see that this is pretty small, but these also come in really big sizes. Here's a medium-sized one. And I'm going to talk about these in a second and explain, because their use is not totally obvious. And then developing on from them, there is another kind of hand screw that looks very similar to this, but it differs in some fundamental ways, and these are known, because they were originally patented by the person, these are known as Jorgensen clamps. And then we have the pin clamps and G clamps and bar clamps and a whole bunch of things. But let's start with what was probably the most common of clamps. Originally we used to just have a big piece of wood with a screw at one end and a pin, and you could tighten the screw so that the workpiece would be held. But then the first big advantage was that we invented one of these. Now, this is called a hand screw, and there are two jaws, and there's an inside handle and an outside handle. If you look closely, you'll see that both screws are engaged by threads in one of the arms, and in the other arm it's just a hole, and it's the same at the other end. The trick to using these clamps, if you want to not damage them or damage yourself, is to always keep them parallel and move both arms together, whichever way you go. If you only turn one, which we'll do at the end, but if you only turn one, then you end up bending the arms so that they're no longer parallel. So the basic way of, say, I want to clamp these two pieces of wood together, is to loosen the clamp like this to where this will fit in, and then tighten both of them so that they're both parallel, like this. And then when they're pretty much tight, you can see the jaws are now parallel. All I need to do is to tighten the back one, and bingo, I have the two pieces of wood tightly together, or sufficiently tightly together for me to do whatever it is that I want to do. And as I said before, this is a wooden hand screw, and they come in a big range of sizes, from little tiny ones to ones even bigger than this. So you can see some of them around my shop here. And of course you choose the one that is most convenient for the work in hand. But to repeat, the important thing is to keep the jaws parallel. But what do you do if you want to clamp something, or want to clamp two pieces of wood, say for example, and you could clamp even more, that are not parallel? Well, that's where these come into effect. These are known as Jorgensen clamps because they were originally invented by a chap called Jorgensen, and they don't have wooden screws, but they have metal screws. Not only that, the metal screws go through pins, which means that you can open these exactly the same way that you do with the wooden clamps, but you can also make them so they're not parallel. Here is an example of a bigger Jorgensen clamp, and you can see how I managed to clamp something that is not parallel, right? Same thing. I tighten this, and then I tighten that, and now I've got something that will hold things together that are not absolutely parallel. So, hand screws, whether they're wooden ones or whether they're Jorgensen ones with metal screws, that, by the way, it's important to keep clean, these are perhaps the most fundamental ones of all. Let's look at some of the other kinds of hand screws that developed from the basic wooden ones. Originally we used to use a big bar, and there'd be a screw at one end and a pin that was either adjustable by fitting into different holes, or clamps that would move along. But nowadays, if we're talking about bar clamps, we typically mean one of these. Every shop should have some of these. These are good for several reasons. Firstly, you can just buy the end pieces and attach them to whatever length of bar you happen to find that is convenient. Secondly, they invariably come with little plastic pads, which go a long way to protecting the wood. And you adjust them by pulling this, and then whatever you want to clamp you can put in there, and then you can tighten it down. Now, these are pretty universal, and they're pretty good. And they tend to be basically all put on the same length a piece of wood. But if you wanted to clamp something really large, even though you can find really big bar clamps. Here's a particularly old-fashioned one, but I've put a little pad on here and a pad on here to protect the wood. This is pretty big, but if I wanted to, I could make something capable of holding wood together even longer by using 2 bar clamps. Here's one and here's another. Look, if I release the pin and slide this down, I can now, by turning this around, I can now clamp a piece of wood, or several pieces of wood, that go from here all the way down to there. And of course, the further I go, and even the more I use, the longer the piece of wood I have. So there's no real excuse for not clamping something together, not holding something together. It really is, to repeat what I said before, part of the second great rule of woodworking. Keep the workpiece secure, whether it's freely secure or whether it's secured to the bench. So now we've talked about hand screws, the wooden ones, the little tiny ones and the big ones. We've talked about Jorgensen's, big and small. We've talked about bar clamps. You can use a single one, you can just buy these, or you can buy the whole thing. You can use them in pairs to clamp something really huge. But there are a lot of other things. Here's another little clamp. This is also a useful thing. This can be put into your vise and will hold something really small. It's a bit like a pin vise, which looks like a screwdriver, but that will hold something as small as a needle. Then the next, probably the biggest kind of clamp, is something which in America is known as a C-clamp. In Britain, I think slightly more logically, these are known as G-clamps. Looks like the letter G, right? These also come in a huge range of sizes, from little tiny things from little big ones. So the secret with all of these clamps is to choose the clamp that's most appropriate to the size of the work that you're working with. It used to be said that, I mentioned this as a good habit to get into, it used to be said that you can never have too many clamps. But I should point out that unless you take the trouble to store your clamps in some kind of systematic manner, you can look up here and you can see my hand screws. You can look on the other side of the shop and you can see all my Jorgensen clamps. And then over in the corner, I have a rack that needs to be repaired where I keep all the bar clamps. If you don't keep things organized, then having too many clamps kind of defeats the purpose. More modern inventions are little bar clamps like this. And once again, these also come in a huge range of sizes, from little tiny ones to big ones. But these also typically come with little plastic covers to protect the wood. And at this stage of the game, I want to repeat what I said at the beginning, that clamping is basically designed as a method of holding pieces together, not necessarily really squeezing them together. If you clamp too much, you can actually deform things. Here is the last kind of clamp, a little hand clamp, but you'll see these also come with little plastic jaws, to protect the work. So there are a lot of different clamps, each of which is good for a specific purpose. If you want to know more about clamps, all the different kinds, the old ones and the new ones, then I recommend that you go take a look at my website, where you can see a list of all the books that I've written. And this one is volume 2, and this talks about all the different classes of tools. We talked in the last episode about measuring tools. Now we've talked about clamping tools. So I hope you like that, and don't forget to subscribe. Hit the little button down there. It's the button that the more people that subscribe, the more successful it makes this channel and the more I can do these things. If you should want to take lessons, you can also go to my site, where you can find my phone number and my email number and whatever. And I'm, even though I teach at different places throughout the country, I'm happy to give classes in this particular shop if you happen to be anywhere near Woodstock, New York. So by all means, feel free to email or telephone me. So I hope that was interesting. I hope that was a good little introduction to the world of clamping or cramping, depending on whether you want to be American or British, but it's basically the same thing. And I wish you a lot of luck. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.